Q.
Hello and welcome to what promises to be an extremely exciting next session in the India Today E-Conclave series focused on the coronavirus pandemic. Today we have an extremely special guest who joins us all the way from Boston in the United States. Peter Kolchinsky is a well-known virologist. He's one of America's most sought after biotech investors, and his voice, especially on social media, has become one of the most sought after voices making sense of this pandemic for millions across the world. Investors, and his voice, especially on social media, has become one of the most sought after voices making sense of this pandemic for millions across the world. A privilege and a pleasure. Thank you, Peter, for being with us on India Today.
Thanks for having me.
Peter, I'm going to start straight off with, a thread that you put out on Twitter a few days ago, which has gone totally viral. It's been retweeted, tens of thousands of times. People have been quoting it all over the world. It is a thread where you describe viruses in general and the novel coronavirus in particular as an evil genius. Why did you call it an evil genius, Peter?
Well, first, on behalf of all scientists, I want to say that viruses are not evil or good or geniuses. It's just nature. But this virus is our common enemy, and so when I'm talking to the broader public, it probably helps to recognize that we consider it to be an evil, and we are mounting this heroic effort to overcome it. And so, really, I would probably want to emphasize the genius part of it. There's something that this virus did, and not really did, but evolved to be able to do, that made it more dangerous for us than the first SARS virus, right? Mm-hmm. This one we call SARS-2, the other one was SARS-1. They are somewhat related. And this one decided, again, it didn't decide, it evolved to do. So I keep switching between cartoonish language and science, but it decided that it was going to silently infect us, maybe cause mild symptoms, just in the throat, in the upper respiratory area, and spread before starting to replicate in our lungs and causing severe disease. The first SARS virus went for the lungs much faster. So it caused severe disease, and therefore, we were able to see who was sick, and we were able to socially distance, and we were able to quarantine the first SARS virus out of existence. It's such a small difference in strategy, but it was the key difference.
Has SARS-2 outsmarted us, Peter? There is a sense that this is a virus, against which the smartest minds in the world have united to work on. Everyone's looking for a solution, either a cure or a vaccine. Why does it feel like SARS-2 has, outsmarted humanity so far, at least?
I think that that's maybe going a little too far. There's plenty of people that are smart enough to keep their distance and stay away and deprive this virus of the crowds that it enjoys. And the trouble is that we are only as effective as the dumbest of us. And when you see crowds in the street, you realize that it doesn't matter how smart you are. The question is, how smart is everybody else?
True, yeah. How far is a vaccine in that case, Peter? I mean, there are multiple companies, like I said, with the smartest biotech minds in the world looking for a vaccine. What's a realistic time frame before we'll see a workable vaccine against coronavirus?
Sure. I think that in speaking with some of the companies that are working on these vaccines, I'm optimistic that they're going to be able to stick to their timelines. And the first of them are going to bring some number of vaccines, not really that many in a global sense, millions of doses, maybe some tens of millions of doses by the end of this year. And those doses are going to be rightfully reserved for frontline workers, healthcare workers, firefighters. We need those people to stay healthy and confident in being able to show up for work. And then there'll be larger scale vaccine production that comes online I think in the first quarter of next year, hundreds of millions of doses, trending towards maybe even a billion doses. And
Yes.
when we get those kinds of numbers, that's when you're going to start to see large portions of the world start to be vaccinated, probably with some logic as to where those vaccines should go. So, cities, schools, places like that ought to be vaccinated before other places, nursing homes certainly.
Yes. We've got hundreds of viewers tuning into this webinar, Peter, because I'm sure many of them have already seen some of your threads, so they're very interested in knowing what you think. We're already getting a few questions, so over the course of the next 25 minutes, I'll put out some of those questions that our participants on this webinar on the E-Conclave are also asking. But before that, Peter, you have the unique sort of vista or position of both being a virologist as well as being an investor in companies that are actually on the front lines of looking for a solution to the pandemic. Just take us through what it's like. What is fighting this coronavirus really like from a scientist's point of view? Because the picture from the outside is thousands of scientists laboring day and night in their laboratories looking at how to find the weak spot of this virus. What's it like from a scientist's point of view?
So there's a lot of information. If you're a scientist, you're learning really quickly right now.
Yeah.
You're discovering things about coronaviruses that you didn't know before. I'm sure there were some people who knew. There are people who specialize in coronaviruses, but frankly, we have not really had to focus on coronaviruses over the years as an industry. There were pockets of interest at times when SARS and MERS emerged, but those came and went because we were able to contain the virus and the funding dried up for MERS and SARS vaccines. I don't think the funding is going to be drying up. I think we're going to see this through. We are going to bring vaccines and treatments all the way through to patients because of this grand effort. And I'm now in a position where I get to see how all the skills that I've observed put to work developing breast cancer drugs and drugs for neurological disorders are now being put to work, to solve this one common problem. We actually saw this kind of an effort play out over about 15 years to cure hepatitis C. And there are tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world who have hepatitis C. And it's nothing like SARS-2. I mean, it's a virus, it infects your liver, but eventually it can destroy your liver and you would need a transplant and most people would die.
Yeah.
And the industry developed multiple good drugs for it, combined them, and now we have cures, drugs that work almost certainly for everybody. And I'm watching that entire effort condensed down into about 1 year. We're seeing healthcare regulators dropping a lot of the precautions that are employed for making sure that only safe drugs, get to large trials, and saying, look, we're going to have to figure out whether these SARS-2 drugs work and are safe at the same time. We need to take some risks. We're seeing vaccines moving ahead at an incredibly fast pace, and we're having internal debates. We hosted a call last week for people in the diagnostics field and in the vaccine field to try to figure out how can some of these early diagnostic trials also gather the data that the vaccine manufacturers might need to have a sense for how high do our antibody levels need to be in order to protect us. So how can we make the most of the trials that we're running now? And that requires coordination. And there are a number of organizations around the world that are helping to coordinate, but it just so happens that investors are a natural nexus for information exchange. We already have so many companies that come through our office or now across our screens, and they teach us, and so we can now share back. And our team's working on trying to consolidate everything that we know into a large visual map. It's how we gather information, and we look forward to sharing that with the world when we have that done.
Peter, there are several people who are already looking, beyond this virus. What life is like going to be like after a vaccine is found, and the world comes to terms with this coronavirus. Dipanshu Goyal, who's attending this webinar, asks, if things normalize, can this very same virus strike back at a later time, with the same kind of strength? Is that a possibility? The same virus?
So I think that this virus is not going to so much strike back as it's going to just stay with us.
Right.
It's going to be the fifth human coronavirus that just circulates around the world, most likely. The question is going to be whether it's going to feel like a common cold after most people are immune. And if it's not as mild as the common cold, if it's like the flu or more severe than the flu, then it's just going to mean that it's that much more essential that everybody get the vaccine that we will eventually have.
Right.
So this vaccine that we're developing, it's not just a one-time vaccine, for 2021. It's going to be a vaccine that everybody is going to get at some point in their life. And it may be a vaccine that we all get even yearly. Maybe we combine it with the flu vaccines, right? And if people are more scared of SARS-2 for the next decade than they are of flu, then it may actually save lives because, if we end up bundling this vaccine with the flu vaccine, more people will get flu shots.
Yes.
So, it's really all about vaccines.
It is all about vaccines. Abhishek Chaturvedi, I had a related question, but we're getting flooded with questions because there's a huge amount of interest in your work, Peter. Abhishek Chaturvedi asks, about the COVID-19 infection. It currently affects the respiratory system largely. Is there a possibility that, as research continues to try and find a cure and a vaccine, is there a possibility that this same virus and this same condition could start affecting other organs and other systems in the body as well?
So I believe that this virus is already affecting other organs besides the respiratory system. And, here I'm a scientist, not a clinician. So I've not really studied the effects of this virus on the body. But from what I've read, it can directly or indirectly impact the liver, the kidneys, the heart. It's interesting. A lot of people focus on the lethality of the virus. How many people will it kill? But actually, for every person it kills, there's so many more that experience severe symptoms, a severe disease throughout their body. And that can have lasting damage. When your lungs have been as scarred by this infection as what's been seen, it can take years to recover. It can exacerbate asthma. Yeah, so I would say nobody should be focused on just how many people it kills. They should be focused on how many people it harms.
Yes.
So I think that in the future, the real question is going to be whether this disease is milder because we are immune. There's so many asymptomatic patients. Can most of us eventually, when we get sick, actually be asymptomatic or mild? If so, then there's no reason to feel like this virus is going to be any scarier than the viruses we already live with. I don't think that this is a virus that's going to mutate into something very different. I don't think it's going to be one that suddenly starts attacking other organs in ways we're not seeing now. This virus actually doesn't like to mutate. And I've written a tweet thread on that explaining that, unlike flu, this virus is in some ways, much more difficult. It has a much more difficult time mutating.
Yes.
It tries to avoid making errors. And so that actually helps us. It means that the virus we're going to be living with for years and years is to stay very much like the one we have today.
Peter, here in India, we've just hit, what promises to be another very, very warm summer. There have been conflicting reports that, weather change could have an effect on transmission and the viability of this virus. Where do you stand on that, on temperature, weather having some kind of an impact?
So I think that in this case, because this is the first time that humanity has seen this virus and we have no immunity, the advantage that this virus has is so great that the slight advantages and disadvantages that might normally cause a fluctuation in cold viruses or flu viruses, kind of don't matter to this virus. Right now, it's able to tear through any country. Singapore is seeing a resurgence. Iran, and in India, parts of your country are very warm and you're still seeing cases. So I don't think that seasonality is a big part of how this virus is going to spread. In the future, when our immune systems, are revved up, when we've taken the vaccine or some people have recovered, I think then the balance of power is a little bit more even, and therefore slight advantages that the virus might have during cold seasons, might tip the scales and we might see more infections. And otherwise, during warm and humid, seasons, if it's like the cold viruses that we have, and it probably should be, then maybe those are going to be milder seasons.
Yes. We've got multiple questions from Meghna Verma and several others, Peter, on the wave of reinfections. There are countries, including here in India, that have celebrated the large number of people who recovered or survived COVID-19. How do you see the wave of reinfections? Many people who've been declared safe of the virus and then tested positive again.
Yeah, so I think it's very important that we really can tell the difference between a true reinfection and what just seems like the virus went away. So tests can sometimes give back a false negative result.
Yes.
You're actually looking for virus in your body using a PCR test, looking for bits of its genome, then it really matters where you sample. If the virus was in your throat or was in your nasal passages, and you detected it there with a test, then you would say, oh, I'm positive for the virus. And later, when the virus, if it goes down to your lungs, but maybe it stops replicating in your nose, or maybe the person who sampled your nasal passages didn't really reach in there deep. Most people don't appreciate how invasive and uncomfortable a proper nasal swab is. And if the person who's doing this on a patient takes it easy, doesn't want to hurt them, they might miss sampling the virus. And so the test will come back negative. Right. And if you're feeling like you're symptom-free, you might say, oh, well, I'm symptom-free and the test is negative. I must be, recovered. Yes. And so later, if it turns out you're not recovered and the virus, comes back or gives you symptoms, then you might think I must have been reinfected. But in reality, you were just never over your first infection. So I think that if somebody recovers and then months later they get a confirmed case of COVID-19 and they're positive for SARS-2, I think we can talk about reinfection. But if we're talking days or maybe a week, then maybe they just weren't over their first infection.
I'm glad you put that into perspective. And now I'd like to bring you to the Indian example, Peter, because this is 1.3 billion people under a lockdown that's going to stretch for more than a month. It's the biggest lockdown the world has ever seen. There's been praise and there's been criticism, for what such a large and extended lockdown can actually achieve. How do you see it? When sort of juxtaposed with the data, the numbers, the number of cases and deaths in India, how do you see this lockdown here?
So I think actually that if we go back in history, we might discover that this isn't the first time that we've grappled with these same issues. I just tweeted yesterday a thread by somebody on NPR that went back and studied the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, particularly in San Francisco. And there were protests against social distancing and wearing masks. We're just repeating the same thing we went through. And sometimes I find that really disappointing to discover that we're not unique snowflakes. We're not, special. We're just the same creatures we always were, and we act the same ways. But that means that there are lessons for us in the past. So this is really hard, no doubt. But I do think that we live in a world where, at least in some countries, from an economic standpoint, we have leaders that are capable, if they want, they're capable of seeing that it's possible to help people through, to provide funding and a safety net, to allow them to stay in their homes, to not have to show up for work, but to still get paychecks. It doesn't mean that we are collectively accruing a debt that we will have to repay, but that's what you do when, as a family, you go through a tough crisis, you take on some debt, and later you're going to work through it, right? And so we can do that together as one giant community. not just as one country, but as a world. And I hope we see more of that kind of, clear thinking.
This is India's health ministry, Peter, just yesterday said that 80% of India's cases are asymptomatic, and that's gotten a lot of people wondering. In fact, we've got a participant on the webinar, Pratik Gupta, who asks, what's going on with all the asymptomatic cases? Is it possible that the coronavirus has been more prevalent than we believe? And what are the chances of transmission in asymptomatic cases? How do you see that?
Yeah, so asymptomatic cases absolutely can transmit the virus. As I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, when it's replicating in your nasal passages, you may not feel that, or maybe it's just a mild irritation. You don't even think that you're infected. And yet it's precisely from the upper respiratory tract that you are spreading it to others just by speaking. There's a remarkable video, and I've linked to it in one of my threads, that shows in slow motion imaging the particles of micro droplets that spread between people when they're merely speaking, even when they're breathing. And it certainly changed the way that I think about, what it means to just stand face to face speaking with another person. And I think that we have to be much more mindful, of our role in transmitting this virus, regardless of how we feel. You may say you're not infected, fine, wear a mask anyway, just in case you are. And you're doing it not for yourself. At that point, if you're infected, you're doing it for everybody else, people you love. So I think that a 5% lethality rate, which, that's calculated based on all the people who are diagnosed, and that's not uncommon, to find regions where they say 5% of the people who've diagnosed are dying. If you discover that actually there are 5 times as many people infected, but 80% of them are asymptomatic, what that really means is that your lethality rate is 1%, not 5%.
Right.
So I think that when I look at all the data around the world, an estimated lethality rate of about 1% is sort of, it fits with the data. The reality is that we're making big estimates here. Could it be that it's 1.5% or 2%? Maybe. Could it be that it's as low as 0.2%? Sure. If you look amongst the data, you can find evidence that will reassure you that it's that low. The trouble is that even if it is, 0.2%, if as a world we don't socially distance and you multiply that by billions, that's an awful lot of death. So we're really looking at something like packing in an extra 6 months or a year and a half worth of death into a year, right? In addition to all the normal death and suffering that we experience, imagine a whole extra year's worth. So that's what we're trying to avoid here by depriving this virus of the crowds that it needs in order to spread.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because we had quite a few questions about precisely that. How is life going to change? Are many of these things that we're having to do now going to extend over the next 6 months and a year beyond, any sort of finish line, as it were, as far as the coronavirus fight is concerned? One final question, if I may, Peter, is on the United States itself. The world tends to look at the United States as a country that's got it sorted, sets the standards as far as being able to fight a pandemic is concerned. From your perspective there in Boston, what went wrong? The numbers are completely off the charts in the United States.
Yeah, what went wrong, I think, is that when people think that they're really great at something, that's when they may be most vulnerable. So I think that our country, and we're certainly not the only one, lacked due humility, as to the level of preparation, coordination that would be required to really mount a response. And I'm gonna put in a plug here for Hollywood. I rewatched the movie Contagion a couple days ago. And it is absolutely amazing how much of what we are going through right now was already envisioned by Hollywood. Now, it's not that they envisioned it, it's that they read the preparedness reports. They studied, they talked to scientists to figure out how would a pandemic go. And they saw the problems, they saw the pushback against, social distancing. They studied their history,
Yes.
and it was right there in the movie, right? And so it's not that this was all impossible to know. I think it was just a lack of imagination that this time it was for real. We'd contained MERS, we'd contained SARS. I'm sure we would contain this, people must have said to themselves. The CDC did a good job distributing Zika tests that actually worked. And so there was this confidence that they'll do it again. And you learn, certainly as an investor, to think about preserving options, to hedge, as it's known. Are you so sure that this one, best effort is going to work? Are you sure you don't want to invest in a second or third backup option? It's how investors think. It's really how all of us need to think. And I hope that in the future, we're going to study all of the different technologies, modalities, as we call them, and think, I have my favorite one, I have my favorite diagnostic test, but maybe we should develop a few backup plans and be ready to push the button to kick those into gear in case the first one's not working out, right? And truly develop a diversified approach to the next pandemic, because it's not going to look like this one. It's going to look a bit different. If we were to see avian flu, for example, spreading, if a virus like H5N1 were to become readily transmissible between humans, which it's not, but if it were, then it's not just going to kill the elderly. In fact, it's going to go more for younger people, like Spanish flu did, if it's going to be anything like what we've seen so far. And that changes the dynamics.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think we need to be more creative everywhere and more humble about what we don't know.
So it's not just the current pandemic. We've got to keep options open for what can come next after COVID-19 as well. Peter Kolchinsky, this has been a privilege. We've learned a lot. Many of our viewers and participants have gotten their questions answered as well. And I'm sure all of them will tune into you now on social media as well to see how you take the narrative and the story forward. There is so much left to learn. Thank you so much for giving us your time and joining us on this India Today E-Conclave.
Thanks, Shiv. All right, take care.
Thank you. All right, we'll have much more for you on the E-Conclave series here on India Today ahead. Thanks for tuning in.